Hello, hi, and welcome to the next in our live streams. We are looking tonight at trauma and young people. And if you're joining us live, we're really glad you're here. If you're watching us back afterwards, hope it's useful. Just to introduce you, if you haven't met us yet, I'm Jenny Flanagan, known as Jenny F, and I'm a psychotherapist, and I co-manage a project called Illumina that we'll mention in a moment. And I live in beautiful Devon, so that's where I'm coming to you from tonight.
I'm Jenny C, so I'm Jenny Cavendish, and I am 6 months away from graduating as a psychotherapist. So it's getting very real. And I'm in the slightly less beautiful, but very well named city of Reconciliation. So I'm in Coventry, which I always think is a good place to begin anything around trauma, thinking about reconciliation.
Absolutely. And we're really glad you're joining us tonight. We are, you can see on our slides, we are Headstrong. Headstrong is the name that's given to all of our mental health and well-being work that we do at Youthscape, which is a national youth charity. And part of Headstrong is the Illumina project, which Jen and I run, which aims to support young people struggling with self-harm. Anyone between 11 and 19 can access free online support through our Illumina project at selfharm.co.uk. You can find out more about either of those things by Googling them, and you'll find our websites and find out lots more resources. But let's get on to tonight's topic, which is a really big one. And we really hope that you will chime in with some questions if you've come with particular things that you want answered or you want to understand. This is something we could obviously spend days talking about. It's a really complex and relevant and important topic, which people have written enormous books on, some of which we'll recommend to you later. But we want to give a kind of introduction tonight to what it's good that we should understand about trauma as it relates to young people. So, Jen, what exactly is trauma?
Wow, this is like such a big place to start with. Sure, what is trauma? Well, one of my favourite quotes is by somebody called Gabor Mate, and he says that trauma isn't what happened to you, trauma is the body's response to what happened to you. And I think quite often when we think about trauma, we can get a little bit stuck in, well, is this a traumatic experience? Is this trauma? Is this trauma? And rather than thinking about trauma as the event, we're going to think instead about it being the physiological response from the event that causes a lasting response to us. So we're going to think about how trauma changes our brains, how trauma changes the way that a young person might relate to other people, how it might feel like actually there isn't the language to explain it because it's so much a felt and experiential thing that happens rather than it being this one event. And I think especially with lots of young people that I work with, trauma can kind of be thrown around a bit of, oh, I've experienced a trauma, without a lot of understanding around what the impact is. So we're going to think especially around how, when you have experienced an event like this, trauma then impacts our ability to cope, makes us fear that things are going to happen again, and to perhaps trigger a certain response in us. And it's also worth recognizing that two people may have experienced the same event, but they may well have really different responses to that event. And a lot of that comes from what our foundations are like. So how we respond to an event is shaped by our history, and some of that we'll be really aware of and some of it we won't. But especially if we've had really stable relationships in childhood and a lot of sort of stability in things that are going on for us, by the time we reach teenagehood, we may be able to bounce back from an experience that happens in a much more easy way than somebody who hasn't had the same kind of stable experiences. The same as if somebody has always grown up with there being warmth and food, and suddenly one time there isn't food, that may well be not experienced in the same way as somebody who has grown up with always having to fight for food and things like that. And the other thing that's worth remembering is often if somebody has had an experience like this, they may be diagnosed with something like post-traumatic stress disorder afterwards. And that's whether it's been a one-off event or something really long-term like a cumulative trauma. It can impact anybody. And it's a psychiatric diagnosis. So it's something that people go, actually, you meet this kind of criteria to have had this. And it means that even a month or so after the event has happened, you are still having dreams or memories or reliving it in a point that it feels in your body like the trauma is happening right in that moment. Even though you may be in a really safe place, you still feel like it's happening. And people sometimes say that that's re-traumatizing, but the really helpful language is instead think about it as being re-remembering. So it's when somebody has a trauma reaction and they re-remember the event to such an extent, it feels like it's only just happening now. And we kind of only know a bit about this maybe over the last 20, 30, 40 years. There's been so much more research into sort of what is trauma and what happens. So it's almost like a live thing. As we're talking about this now, we're going to recommend what we know as the facts for now and the theories for now, kind of on the understanding that this may well change as more people have researched this as well. So although we're really hopeful that it's something that's helpful for you, it's definitely something that's still live as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the reason that we know so much more about trauma is because of MRI imaging, which has become, the way that we can now look into brains and see actually what's happening in activity in a way that we couldn't, say, 30 years ago. So that's been like a massive step forward, which means we can now look at someone's brain who has experienced a trauma and see how it has changed their brain, which is an astonishing thing. And actually, really unusual, because with so many mental health challenges, mental health diagnoses, you look at someone's brain and actually you can't see a kind of biological thing that is happening that's like, oh yes, that person has depression, or oh yes, that one person has ADHD, or whatever diagnosis it is, which makes dealing with mental health and talking about it and finding a language for it really challenging. But there are ways in which we can see that trauma changes our brain, which is kind of extraordinary. And we're going to come to that a little bit more in a little while. But why is it helpful for us to understand trauma when we're working with young people? Well, there's a number of reasons. And one of them relates to that question of mental health diagnosis. There's often a really strong correlation between people who've experienced trauma and then other symptoms that they present, which we're going to hopefully make a little bit more sense of tonight, but which aren't always completely obvious that they relate to trauma. They might just look like a symptom of a different diagnosis. But when we can start to make sense maybe of what someone might have experienced or how that is affecting them, and what trauma does to us, and how that then becomes visible, becomes kind of obvious in the outside world, then we start to be able to understand a little bit more what might be going on for a young person and how best to support them. Sometimes mental health diagnoses, and I imagine we probably all have different experiences of them and feelings towards them. It's often a controversial topic. But one of the challenges is that sometimes mental health diagnoses can just be seen as a switch is flicked in your brain, something genetic, something biological has happened, and now you have these symptoms and you have this mental health condition. It's maybe hereditary, it's maybe a kind of biological thing. And actually what trauma does, I think, is that it makes us ask questions about context and about story and about what might have happened to somebody, which means that they are dealing with it or they are behaving in a certain way. And that helps us, I think, to be much less judgmental about someone's behavior. I hope it helps us to be more compassionate towards, understanding why they might be behaving in that way, why they might be presenting in this way. So I think an understanding of trauma, an understanding of how to recognize that when working with young people, in some ways it kind of helps us make sense of the puzzle sometimes of some of the really deep challenges when we're working with young people. It helps us to discern something of a story or something of a kind of logical sense to some of the things that are going on. But I think it also helps us to be more compassionate in how we are with the young person, how we get alongside them. there's a lot of typical behaviors, which obviously that are challenging, that are associated with teenagers in general. So things like really risky behaviors. We know that there's biological reasons why your typical teenager who maybe hasn't been through anything traumatic is more likely to engage in risky behaviors at the age of 15 than they are maybe when they're 27. But some of these really typical behaviors actually have a really strong overlap with things, I guess, behaviors which are often connected with an experience of trauma. And so, whereas we might, because we work with teenagers for ages, think that's just what teenagers like, that's just what they do, this is just what they do. Again, an understanding of trauma just kind of slows us down a little bit to say, okay, this could be a typical teenage, kind of acting out, or all the things that teenagers usually do. But let me just kind of slow down for a second to wonder if there might also be other reasons and another story behind it. And then, of course, when we can start to discern those things, and it's something that, we're probably not going to be able to just work out on our own. It's not that we're saying go out and go and find trauma wherever you can, but when we can be a little bit more aware and alert of how this plays out and what it looks like, it enables us to be able to have conversations with other professionals, maybe to find the kind of more professional help and support that someone might need if they've been through something like that, or just to coordinate how we're getting alongside a young person, how we're supporting them in a way that is sensitive and compassionate and informed. And so really that's why we're wanting to have this conversation. There are plenty of other people out there that we will recommend to you later as well, who do more training in all kinds of different contexts that relate to trauma, that make us, more skilled up in being able to recognize this. But we really hope this is going to be a helpful introduction to support any of the work or any of the contact that you have with young people. It's hard to navigate both adolescence and trauma. And I guess that's another reason why we want to be able to talk about those things together. Adolescence has its own challenges. Trauma adds in a whole other kind of raft of challenges in terms of survival and managing ourselves and regulating ourselves, calming ourselves down. And that can be immensely difficult for young people. And so the more support that we can offer them, the more kind of informed support we can offer them, the better. I feel like there's probably loads more reasons why I particularly want us to talk about trauma with young people, but I'm going to move us on now. Otherwise, we'll never get through everything tonight.
Wow. How does trauma affect people? And in a way, it's like, this is such a big thing to just try and break down. We're not going to sit and say, well, this is a trauma and this isn't a trauma. So we are looking at it instead of recognizing that a young person may well have experienced something. And that could be even back when they're in the womb, could be in the first couple of years of life before they have the language for it. So it could be something that you or they are aware has happened, but it could also be something that is happening live at the moment or has happened recently. It doesn't have to be this big event, sort of a young person that's been caught up in a large car accident that everybody's aware of. It could also be the living in a cumulative trauma, so living with a constant neglect or threat. It could be a sense of I don't feel safe that is happening through situations that a young person is living in. So it may even be something that you or they are not aware of to put the language of trauma around it. And it might be something that they don't even think about as trauma for the next 20 or 30 years. And so we're going to think about how it's impacted the brain, but whether or not they or you are using the word trauma around this. And I'm going to begin by thinking about what is kind of sometimes known as the triune brain. And this is an idea that we can look at the brain as having three parts. This came up with a scientist called McLean in about 1990. And it's a very simplified way of thinking about the brain, but it's really helpful for situations like this. And I wonder, Jenny, can you demonstrate with your hands while I'm doing this? Because I'm not very good at the hands and the talking.
Absolutely. This is Dan Siegel, isn't it? And his like hand brain thing. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. So thinking about the oldest part of our brain, and that's what we might call the reptilian brain. So it's connected onto our brain stems and our spinal cord. And sometimes at the back of your neck, you can kind of feel the little bit of the lump of where sort of it's all connected. And the main purpose of this part of the brain is for survival. And it's for the basic and the vital bodily functions. So breathing, balance, temperature. And these are the parts of the brain just works instinctively. It's all about safety. And if you're around very small babies, they do a thing of generally just crying until their needs are met. And so it's a little bit of that. It's kind of going, everything is happening. Something feels out of whack. I need somebody to help me with this. But the older we get, the more we're able to regulate all of those things ourselves. If we're hot, we go and take a jumper off. That kind of thing. Our bodies cool us down and warm us up. Then the next part of our brain can sometimes be called the mammalian brain or the limbic brain. And this controls our expression of emotions, processing of short-term memories, these kind of parts. And it contains a part of the brain that you may well have heard of called the amygdala, which is about the size of an almond. And it's the shape of a seahorse. I told someone the other day it was a starfish, and I now have to keep pausing and go, not a starfish, a seahorse. Almost kind of like little C-shaped part of our brain. And a huge amount of our emotional language and our emotions come from this, especially some of our really strong emotions and how we express them. And then following on from that is the next part that is only fully developed by the time, for most of us, we're in our mid-20s. And that can be called prefrontal cortex. It can be called the non-mammalian brain. And this is the part that, as adults, we get really used to using all the time. And we get a bit confused why young people aren't using this all the time. And it's the part that engages with our higher level thinking, rationalizing situations, analyzing, logic, planning, lots of really conscious processes. And so for us as an adult, if we're faced with a dilemma, this is the part of our brain that we use to weigh up what possible options there are. And as adults, we learn to rely on this a lot because we've learned the skills to be able to have got there. But for young people that you may well be working with, this part isn't fully developed. So as Jenny said, there's a lot that happens that means, well, is this because of some young person's trauma, or is this because of how their brain is at the moment? But regardless of which, and despite how sophisticated or how old somebody is, the primary function of the brain is self-preservation. So it's all about if there's threat or danger, or a perceived threat or danger, the brain overrides the logical, intellectual parts and focuses instead on the really older survival parts. And it's the limbic part of the brain's response to threat and danger comes from the amygdala. And the amygdala processes information and kind of goes, is this safe? But rather than the amygdala then relying on the top, on the cortex of going, well, I don't know, let's weigh this up. Instead, it goes, probably isn't safe, hasn't been safe before, assume it isn't safe this time. And then goes to what we might call our fight or flight response. And it activates the nervous system, so prepares the body for this danger, increases heart rate, increases blood oxygen levels, blood flow to muscles, deactivates all non-crucial bodily systems. So that's the bit that if you're really stressed and you suddenly go, oh my goodness, I need to go and do a poo, that's because the brain is preparing you for what could happen. And if somebody has experienced a trauma of any kind, the brain can then get jammed in this alarm system. So it can be like they are always hypervigilant, and the amygdala is always going, here is a danger, or here is there likely to be a danger. And it leaves the person in this place of almost constant state of arousal. So their heart rate is always beating faster, and there is always more blood flow going to their muscles, ready for them to fight, to run away, to play dead, whatever it is that's needed. because trauma can literally change the brain by allowing it not to reset to how it should or how we want it to. And there's kind of another way of thinking about it, a bit like flipping your lid. So if you think of the lower parts or the downstairs part of the brain focused on safety and emotion and basic functioning, and then suddenly there's a danger, it's like the upstairs brain has just switched off, gone offline, and decisions are made from a flipped lid place. So the young person is constantly responding as if the lid is permanently flipped up. And they're constantly looking for what the danger is, assuming that there is going to be a danger. And as people around who are supporting young people with this, you may be really aware because you see young people have this reaction. You see them come into the room and go, I don't know if this is safe. Or you might see them be very, very anxious about situations or look to control situations because that feels safer. You may also work with young people who very easily flip their lid. They have a very narrow window of what they can tolerate before it becomes, this is it. And that's because their brain is constantly on a hypervigilant state. Think about what that's like for us when we're feeling particularly stressed or particularly something's going on, and then suddenly living like that all the time. So that's the impact on the brain. And then we're going to think of it doesn't just stop there. There's sort of all the rest of the life that the young person is living in. So Jenny's going to help us think about that too.
So how does trauma affect bodies? How does it affect young people's bodies? I guess it's really important to understand the connection. There is, of course, a massive connection between our brains and our bodies. So just as Jen was talking about, when we perceive threat, whether that's because there is a threat or because we're on hyper alert and we see threat everywhere, and our kind of limbic system kind of kicks in and tells us we have to survive, we have to fight, we have to fly from here, we have to freeze, do one of our kind of instinctive survival responses. Those things, of course, happen in our bodies. So our brains are sending all kinds of signals to our bodies all the time, which is keeping them in a state of tension, of stress, of perhaps perpetual anxiety and kind of fear, perhaps anger, depending on what our habitual response has been to the trauma. So the experience of trauma itself, generally experts agree that it's about an experience of feeling helpless, powerless, in danger, unable to do anything. It's an experience that overwhelms our ability to manage and to cope with. We just feel absolutely kind of powerless in the face of what is happening. And I should say as well, I guess it's helpful to say it can be something that happens directly to us, or it can be something that we witness happening to other people, or somebody can experience trauma from seeing something happen to other people. So whatever our brain is doing in terms of telling us we need to be afraid of something, telling us we need to be alert, that whatever is happening there is sending immediate messages to our body. So it's having a big impact on how we feel, on how we move, and our connection to our bodies. Emotions, in fact, are things that happen in our bodies. Anger, sadness, fear, happiness, joy, they're all things that register physically. We often tend to think of them as being things that happen in our heads because that's why we kind of make sense of them and process them, but they're actually things that register in our bodies first, and then the kind of message goes up to our brains. So some really important wiring in us that connects how we feel in our bodies with, I guess, what we make sense of that in terms of a story and in terms of emotions. And when we've been traumatized, it's likely that we've had an experience of not feeling safe in our bodies. And that can have a massive impact then on how we are in the world, how we feel in our bodies, how much we can make sense of what's happening to us. So to give you an example of some of the things that how this can manifest, some people who've experienced trauma can't feel areas of their body. They might be able to feel some bits, but there'll be some bits that they perhaps can't even feel. They've just completely disconnected from. having this experience of feeling profoundly unsafe in their bodies, often they don't really want to bring very much awareness into their bodies. So if they're doing like a yoga class or something where we're like bringing our awareness into our bodies, that can feel absolutely terrifying and overwhelming for someone who's been traumatized. It's why, yoga practitioners, if they're working with traumatized people, have a kind of specialized training, because just the act of bringing some awareness into our body, if that is an area of our body which has felt profoundly unsafe, violated in any way, then even just kind of mindfully bringing our awareness into that part can absolutely trigger feelings of total panic, fear, powerlessness, and take us back. Because in some ways, our bodies are stuck in that experience of fear and powerlessness that we experience. There are ways in which our bodies are kind of frozen in that and haven't registered that the trauma event has finished. We haven't been able to kind of process it and move past it, partly maybe because we've pushed it away, or because we haven't known what to do. It's felt so paralyzing. We've just stayed in that frozen place and then tried to almost disassociate and kind of forget and push it away. So there's a sense in which our body feels like it is still in the trauma. And this is something which comes up a lot with, veterans from war, in the military, but also with people who've experienced other physical traumas. So part of the journey of helping somebody, a young person who has experienced trauma and is holding it in their body, is about reconnecting that relationship with their body and enabling them to befriend their body. And that's something that needs to happen very slowly and very carefully. But it can feel like a very, very difficult relationship. Sometimes they'll engage in like super high risk behaviors, like extreme self-harming or promiscuity or drugs, as a way, partly because they are struggling to feel a connection with their body, and some of those experiences make them feel like they are actually in their body. They are more like alert and alive than they might otherwise feel. Sometimes it's a feeling of like just total disconnection, like it doesn't even matter what they do with their bodies, and they're trying to manage the emotions. But it's a very difficult and strained relationship, and of one not really feeling safe. Again, so much more to say, but let's move on to relationships.
I read a really interesting study about this that links kind of with our bodies quite recently, which I thought was quite good.
Okay.
And that's about how I'm assuming, Jen, that you're in the same camp as me here. If we went skydiving, we'd probably be at like 100 out of 100 in adrenaline of like, whoa, this is a really quite stressful situation for me. But people who regularly engage in really high risk activities register at something like a 20 out of 100 of adrenaline with this. But if you also imagine the base level of what a 0 is like, of like, yeah, things are average. If we haven't had a traumatic experience, or we've worked through the traumatic experience, our baseline is kind of average. But if somebody has experienced a trauma, they have a level of dissociation almost all the time, just in a keeping yourself safe. So a level of disconnect, as Jenny said, with the body and with the stuff around, that means that their level is below what the average person of their life will be. So they don't have the same highs of this event gives me an adrenaline kick in the way that it would do for other peers as well. And so it's not even just they'll engage with things because they feel disconnected, but it can also be, I'm trying to get some kind of reaction, trying to feel something as well. And apparently the same kind of thing happens for people that regularly do really high risk sports. There's often a kind of an assumed sense of disconnection all the time. It's like, wow, this is probably why I don't do extreme sports. But the idea of a kind of disconnection or disassociation fits in a huge amount when we think about trauma and relationships. So this is when a young person will disconnect from feelings, thoughts, memories, or themselves. And it happens as a self-preservation. And in a way, we all do this to one degree or another in different places. And it's at most times a very average, normal, healthy experience. But when it then means that time periods are missed because somebody has disconnected to that extent, they're actually not sure where they are, what's going on, how to manage a situation. That can be really frightening for them and for people around them. And you may well have young people that you're aware of who experience this level of disconnection or disassociation. And we'll be thinking a bit sort of further on about what it is that can be done to support these things. But it's really, really helpful that the young person can have some language around this, because this can affect relationships, school, college, all of these kind of things. And one of the best things that I think is helpful is to recognize, well, let's look for the people of safety in this, and let's look for the places of safety. So we're going to come back to that in a few slides' time. But for a young person who has experienced trauma, it can impact a huge amount to do with relationships with other people. And that might be an element of just finding it very difficult to trust people and finding it very hard to relate to people. If there's been a particular situation where they felt unsafe for a very long time, there may be other people that remind them of those situations or somebody else's response to this. And I always remember at this point something that happened just after I got married. So when I grew up, my house was very loud and everybody was very angry. And I know that they were angry because doors were slammed a lot. And when I first got married, I was living with my husband, and he was washing up, and I heard him slam the door in the kitchen. And I was like, oh my goodness. And my body went to, something's wrong. Something's wrong here. Why is he angry? And I went into the kitchen and spoke to him, and he was absolutely fine. And I was like, oh, maybe this is me. Maybe this is my reaction. Because I realized in that moment that my husband is just a loud person, and he closes doors loudly and he washes up loudly. So it makes sense that he is going to do all kinds of things like that loudly. And I had to be able to communicate to him, oh, when I hear you do that, I hear it as if I'm 5 years old and someone's slamming a door. And the kind of like what we might call like our inner child bit gets a bit scared. And I've done lots of work to be able to reassure myself, and I know what to do. But you may well have young people around you who you're supporting, who you know, who are in your household, who haven't yet learned the skills to be able to soothe themselves when this happens. And trauma can mean that the relationships with people are impacted, because a young person may well not want to spend time with somebody who evokes that reaction in them. They may well struggle in big, loud places, whether that's school, shopping centres, things like this, because the brain is in a place of hyper alert and looking out for where the danger is. And suddenly, if you're around 1,000 other people in your school, danger can come in lots of different places. And a lot of situations that they may well be saying, I should be able to get on with this, can be really impacted if there's been a history of trauma. There can also be an anxiety around, well, am I going to react like this? Am I going to have a panic attack? What's going to happen in this place? Is this place safe? Do I trust the people around me? And that can impact relationships, especially if you're one of the people that's saying, well, of course you can trust, everything's fine. And we're going to be thinking a bit further on about some of the things that can be really helpful, but also unhelpful to be supporting a young person as well. We also know that relationships can be really impacted over a long period of time as well. And the young person may not even have a language for this. It could just be I don't like being around this. And you may see that by young people who then look to control the situation at that point, to control the narrative. Because they may have learnt, as long as I am here and I am setting the tone for what happens, I know I'm safe. Because I've learnt that I can't trust the people around me to manage this situation, and therefore I will manage it instead. And as a youth worker, as a teacher or a professional, that can sometimes feel really, really hard to navigate, because it can feel like it's really hard work for that young person. And it takes time. It isn't something that we can expect a young person to do straight away. And it isn't something that we can then we can learn to manage straight away. It can take a lot of work together, and that's okay. But often our young people will be expecting everybody has left me beforehand, so you will as well. And consistency is really, really important when supporting young people who have been impacted by trauma.
Yeah. Ben's asked a really interesting question here. It says, self-awareness seems like such a huge thing. Do you have any questions you ask yourself that help you reflect when it comes to how young people might be responding to your actions? And I'd love to know what you think about this, Jen. I guess my instant response is that it can be really hard, I don't know, in a group setting, to, especially if we're managing maybe more than, one relationship at a time. I think it can be very hard to find that space to step back and be thinking about what else might be going on. But I think that it's really helpful to be reflective, afterwards. I think in the moment, the most we can often do is to be as inclusive, as calming, as, kind of warm a presence as possible. Obviously that will also involve some boundaries as well. But to really, I think the space is often away from the young people themselves to think, what could be going on here? Like this felt a bit strange. If there's someone else you can talk to who works with that young person or those young people, it can be a really helpful thing. I find as a therapist, that's part of what I do in supervision, is to go, I'm trying to make sense of this dynamic or this thing. So I think making sure that you have that kind of thinking space, maybe when the young person isn't there, and having a space with somebody else to try and make sense of that, because often we are, and I'm going to come onto this a little bit in a minute when I talk about some of the behavior that sometimes plays out maybe when young people have been affected by trauma. But sometimes we are kind of left like puzzling and really having to think about what might be going on kind of underneath some of the more obvious behavior and dynamics. Jen, do you have particular questions that you ask yourself in that context?
I think I try and hold on to 50% of this is probably me and 50% of this is probably them. And so I think I probably, as much as possible, try and assume I am impacting. And I think that's a really hard thing for us to get our head around, is actually we are always impacting each other. And sometimes that won't be positively. But it's about what we do with that afterwards that's so helpful. I remember a little while ago, something was, the way a situation was handled at my church, I was like, oh, we could have handled that so much better. And I sent a really strongly worded email going, we could have handled this so much better. And I expected that the leadership would say, no, you're wrong. And they didn't. They immediately said, oh, yeah, we totally missed that, didn't we? And for me, that repair that they offered to the rupture in our relationship was massive, because it made me go, oh, I can totally trust that they can hold this and that they can tolerate the fact that we all think differently and we're all still okay. I think if young people have experienced trauma, they may well really fear that actually what's going to happen if I say, I'm really unhappy that you slam the doors like this. And so along with self-awareness needs to become like our ability as adults to be able to offer that repair and say, yeah, actually, I wonder how that did impact you when I did that. And I'm really sorry. And I want to learn and I want to be able to do things differently. And they may well not know, they may well not be able to communicate other than, I don't feel okay when that happens. Or just, I feel a bit anxious when, I don't want to be around, or any of those kind of things. But it's about going, I'm really sorry that's what happened. And I'd like us to work together at what we can do next.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I think, we're not perfect. None of us are. None of us know enough. All of us miss things. But yeah, we're not, young people who've experienced trauma don't need us to be the perfect adult, the perfect clinician. They need us to be willing to own up to our mistakes, be willing to talk about things, be willing to mend things when we mess them up. Those are, absolutely. Okay, let's talk a little bit about behaviours that are often related to trauma. What does it look like when someone has been traumatized? What things might we notice? I'm sure you probably have some ideas. Like I said, there's a huge overlap between some of the things that we might see in adolescence anyway. And relate behaviors that can be related to trauma. Let me maybe start with aggression and anger, because that's one that I've been thinking about a lot recently. There are lots of reasons why adolescents get angry and need to kind of kick out against home and against family and kind of make their way in the world. But anger is also a way, like a defense. It's, it's there in fight, flight, freeze, isn't it? It's the fight. When we feel threatened, a way that we will instinctively try to make ourselves safe in some situations is with aggression. If we've seen that modeled to us, obviously that's something that we know, but sometimes we will reach for aggression because of how absolutely terrified and threatened we feel because of trauma. So yeah, aggression, whether that's physical aggression or even just verbal aggression, but a lot of anger is often a survival mechanism, a way that we feel like we have to act. We're probably not even thinking about it rationally, but a way that someone might feel they absolutely have to behave in order to keep themselves safe. It's the only thing to frighten everyone else away and make them feel at all safe. So I guess that's a classic. Manipulation, that's another one. I think Jen has already mentioned that one. When we've had a feeling of being so completely powerless and out of control, that is absolutely terrifying. And so we will reach for all kinds of strategies that do not make us feel that vulnerable and that powerless again. And then manipulation is an obvious one. Relationships, Jen's just been talking all about that. We'll often resist relationships because relationships have maybe caused us damage. And I was actually thinking about this in relation to bodies. I was reading somewhere this week that when we feel in danger, our most instinctive kind of behavior as human beings to make ourselves feel safe is to cling to somebody else. I remember when I was about 19, being on a youth camp and kind of patrolling the area for teenagers late at night, and a really, really aggressive dog appeared, and I was with another leader. And without thinking about it, I just slowly moved behind him to hold on to him without really realizing what I was doing, because that was what my body was telling me I needed to do to be safe, was to cling to somebody else. And of course, that is really, really confusing for someone who've experienced trauma, because they likely had the experience that somebody else isn't safe. And that isn't a safe thing to do. So they have this kind of massive conflict between part of them wants to move towards a relationship with someone else, and part of their brain is telling them that's the absolute worst thing you can do. So there's often a paralysis and a kind of inability to move towards a relationship and towards someone else. The idea that an adult might be a source of comfort and safety and help is at a very deep level, often quite an alien one if someone has experienced trauma at the hands of somebody else. And so it can be very hard to convince somebody to move towards a relationship or to trust a relationship. And that is often something that will take an awfully long time. As we were talking about, the most instinctive behaviors which keep us safe and which enable us to survive, which is what our brain most wants for us, are fight, flight, and freeze. So the aggression that I've spoken about, the flight, the running away, whether that is moving away from relationships, whether that's physically running away from the home or from the youth club or from the school, or just distancing yourself, is a way to, at a very basic level, try and survive. And freeze. This is often a very complicated one, because people who've experienced a trauma where they felt that they could not fight it and they could not flee it, and they have to kind of at some psychological level play dead, kind of give up, often then have a huge amount of shame that part of their brain tells them you didn't even run away, you didn't even fight it, when they didn't, because they couldn't. So sometimes people will go very passive. they will become very like immobile, but that will often be accompanied by feelings of kind of like hating themselves and thinking that they're weak and awful, and maybe it was a weak part of them which kind of gave in to whatever maybe trauma that they've experienced. So it's that there's usually a kind of one default of those three, which is more likely for a person who's experienced trauma according to what's happened for them. Yeah, and I guess as well as there are like relationships, it might not just be resisting relationships and running away from them. It might be really intense or unstable relationships, which aren't characterized by the same sense of kind of consistency and safety and trust that we might expect to see in a relationship. So it might be someone who forms really intense bonds over and over again, or really volatile relationships. Because in so many ways, we're playing out the pattern of what we know. And if, for example, we've experienced things when we were really young, the way that we experience relationships, our closest relationships when we're younger, a lot of you will know this from attachment theory, often gives us a template for how we make sense of the world and how we replay our relationships in the future. And so someone who's had a really traumatic early experience will find it very hard not to play out some of those same dynamics, because perversely there's a kind of safety in them, even though they are so perhaps destructive. So yeah, those are some of the behaviors that are often related to trauma. But as I said before, I think it's important to say that they can also just look really strange. And I guess one thing that's really key is like behavior that doesn't feel age appropriate. Because often when we've experienced a trauma, it almost kind of locks us in that age, or we kind of go back to that age, or it can stop our brains developing in the normal way. And so it might be that we then start to exhibit behaviors which feel like they're more appropriate for a younger person than we actually are. So some of it will look baffling and strange, and some of our job is to kind of try and think about it and try and make sense of it in the context maybe of a story or of what someone has experienced. But yeah, age inappropriate behavior is another key one.
And one of the things that doesn't help is the dismissal of behaviors that aren't age appropriate. So I'm thinking of things like if you're going on a residential and you're taking young people with you, and you have teenagers who go, I have to sleep with this blanket. If you go, no, you don't really, you'll be fine. Don't take it, your bag will be lighter. All of those kind of things may well not help, because it's taking away some of the support that young person has, some of the tools that they have learnt. Actually, this is something that helps me. And young people will often say to us that it's things like people not acknowledging or people ignoring what it is that they need or that they've asked for in a situation. That then means they say, well, I don't want to ask again. Maybe I'm a burden if I say too much. And the other side of that is also the dismissal of the trauma. So at the point that the young person then feels, well, no one listens to me, nobody wants to be able to help me, because every time I talk about it, someone says, oh, it wasn't that bad, you'll be fine, doesn't really matter. All of these kind of things. It dismisses the pain that the young person has and dismisses their experience. One of the other things that really also doesn't help is expecting too much from a young person who's experienced trauma, but especially expecting that they are able to soothe themselves, regulate themselves, and calm themselves down. And these are things as adults that we may well need to try and model to them. We might need to be able to say, actually, when I feel stressed, this is what I do. When I feel angry, this is what I do. And just help model to them, first of all, that these are emotions that are really normal, that we all feel them. They're not good and bad emotions, just sometimes they're strong. But by recognizing that as adults, we can manage and tolerate these strong emotions, then helps our teenagers be able to acknowledge and identify that they can also tolerate them. But they may well have not had people around or have been placed in situations where it hasn't been safe to be able to acknowledge those emotions. And it could be that they feel safe with you and therefore safe to be able to acknowledge those. And so it may well be that you need to up the amount of modeling that you do of these things to help the young person acknowledge that actually it's okay for me to feel like this too.
Yeah, great. Okay, so one thing that does help, how can we respond compassionately? I mean, I think if we're working with young people, I'm sure we have vast wells of compassion within us that are leading us to do that work. But really, I guess the heart of, I think, of how to respond compassionately is about connection. Healthy connection is really the thing that is the most supportive, the most restorative, the most helpful thing, because actually young people who've experienced trauma will need different things from us at different times. Some of them may well be in a place where they're able to recognize and talk about what's happened to them. Some absolutely won't be able to do that, won't want to, will and that will be really destabilizing and unhelpful for them. So there's really absolutely not a one size fits all. Here's what to say to somebody who's experienced trauma. But the heart of, I think, responding compassionately is about relationship, because actually helping them to experience some degree of consistency, warmth, and safety in a relationship is really, well, first of all, it's the only environment really in which they're gonna, any kind of, healing and help and support is going to be able to happen. But even the kind of preliminary stages, if you like, to maybe this young person getting more specialist support or helping them work through their trauma at some point, even the earliest and most preliminary stages of that are really going to be about helping them to trust someone, helping them to experience consistency, helping them to experience some measure of calm and safety. And that's something that I think we can do, whatever the context in which we're working with young people, we are able to do that. And perhaps we're able to tune in and to spot where that is particularly important. Jen talked about how, about kind of expecting too much from young people. And, what we were saying about people's brains. If someone's experienced trauma, that they have kind of much less ability to calm themselves down, to regulate themselves, to know what they need to do to feel calm. And so what they need is something we call co-regulation, which is somebody else. It's the baby who's crying, who absolutely can't fix their own problem and sort themselves out. They need an adult to calm them down, to bring them back to that feeling of, okay, I'm all right again, I'm all right again. And actually someone who's experienced trauma has got really impaired self-regulation skills. They're not able to kind of just calm themselves down or talk themselves out of it or bring themselves to a kind of calm and relaxed place. That's something that they're going to need somebody else to be able to do with them. And that's something, a measure of self-regulation, of co-regulation, is something that we can offer them as well. It can seem threatening sometimes when we are trying to build a relationship with someone who is maybe quite defensive and quite makes that difficult. But it really is the kind of the heart of everything, I would say, creating that sense of safety for somebody. I don't know. Is there anything else you would think of as really key there, Jen?
Nope, I think a lot of it is so much about how it is that we respond to young people for who it is that they are. We don't see them first as the trauma that has happened to them, and therefore we treat them differently because of that. But we see them for who it is that they are and acknowledge that they may need extra support alongside that as well.
Yeah. And I think respecting that, and respecting that they might not want you to say, I think you've been through a trauma, or, they might not want that to be named. They might not want that to be out in the open. That might be just something that you are aware of, and maybe you can talk to others about in terms of getting them the support they need at the right time. But they might not want that to be at all, talked about, and but you might recognize, I guess, that there is likely some kind of story or context to how they're behaving or how they're being with you. And so often the best thing that we can offer just is that warmth and that connection and that relationship. Yeah. It kind of from what we can know and what we spot, it doesn't need to be made explicit. We don't need to say, look what I've worked out.
Yeah. Because relationships are actually just incredible in how much really healthy relationships do. And they actually build new neuro pathways in our brains. So having good, healthy relationships with people helps us rewire our brains. In the same way that if a young person is bitten by a dog, they may have to learn not all dogs are dangerous. The same thing can happen where they can learn not all people will treat me the same way as that person did. Just because that car I was in wasn't safe, other cars will. And it's the relationships that build those new neuro pathways, because relationships provide safety, they provide connection, and they provide attachment. And having somebody around us that makes us feel secure helps us develop our inner self and helps us be able to grow as a person. And as we said right at the beginning about like the flipping of your lid, it sometimes takes another person to help the lid come back down. It isn't always something, and maybe we shouldn't even expect our young people to have to do it themselves. Relationships provide the stability that each person can be relied upon. And relationships also provide the language. Often when a young person has experienced a trauma, it may be a felt sense, and they may need support from people around to help grow the language around it. And that can help build the connection between the upstairs and the downstairs brain, because it helps say, actually, this person is helping me put the words onto what at the moment just feels like a really frightening experience. And so as well as being able to do that, they provide just the safety and the stability and the security that all our young people are looking for, but especially our young people that have experienced trauma.
Yeah. And, you know, we experience this a lot with the Illumina project that Jen and I run. We work with a lot of young people who are self-harming. And for some of them, trauma is part of their story and part of perhaps their relationship with self-harm. And we know from, I guess, the research that we have read about exactly what Jen was saying about that rewiring of the brains. And it informs what we do in Illumina, because we run groups in which we build safe and secure relationships, not just, you know, with the leaders, but actually kind of with peers. And I guess we were really excited actually a year or two ago to discover some of the research that basically said, hey, what you're doing is exactly the thing that is needed in order to rewire traumatized brains. Those safe group experiences, peer relationships, adult to young person relationships really are the context which enables the healing of the brain just right in the areas where it's most affected by trauma. So I hope that's exciting, as exciting for you as it was for us to discover.
Definitely.
So finally, we're just coming into land, and we wanted to just recommend some places to find help. So there's some great books we can recommend. If you're a reader, there are some wonderful books that have been written that help kind of make sense of some more of this if you want to know some more. Dan Siegel, who did the hand-brain model, he wrote a book called Brainstorm, which is a great one for understanding particularly what's going on in the adolescent brain and also how that relates to trauma. If you want to know more about the body, this is an amazing book, The Body Keeps the Score. I'm sure some of you will have heard of it. An amazing kind of psychiatrist and therapist in the States called Bessel van der Kolk, who's done an extraordinary amount of research about how trauma is held in our bodies and how it affects us, and how we can't kind of just look at the brain, we can't just look at the body. We actually have to, if we're going to work make sense of trauma, we have to look at ways to look at both. It's a really inspiring read. What else would I want to recommend? There's a website, there's a place called Beacon House, which does provides a lot of resources, especially for working with young people, and they are really clued up as well on things to do with trauma. So yeah, if you Google Beacon House, there's a lot of online resources which are really practical and which can really help you. There is an organization called Trauma in Schools, which actually trains teachers and school professionals to have what they call a trauma-informed approach. Jen's done the training, in fact. It's headed up by someone called Dr. Margot Sunderland, who's a very famous child psychotherapist. If you Google trauma-informed schools, that might be something which you can look at exploring in terms of if you work in a school with young people and you're looking at kind of bringing more awareness in. Because often, difficult behaviour is a manifestation of trauma, and actually if there can be a kind of joined up understanding and approach of how that might play out in a school, there can be a much better and more supportive and joined up way of responding and supporting young people, rather than very different approaches. Anything else you want to throw in before we finish, Jen?
If you're interested in the difference that happens kind of before a baby is born, there's a really brilliant book called Why Love Matters by Sue Gerhardt. And I think that's a really good one that helps think about it, but don't read it if you're currently pregnant or trying for a baby. As somebody who's pregnant, I recommend not reading it then, but it's really helpful all other times.
Okay, great. And do get in touch if you've got other questions you didn't want to ask publicly. There are other things that maybe you're watching this back later and you think you'd like to ask us. You are really welcome to email us. And look, it's just popped up. You can email the team, helloillumina@eastscape.co.uk, and you'll get through to me or Jen. And we'd really love to answer any more questions you have, if we can. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. And we'll look forward to having you back on another YouTube Live at some point in the future. So watch out for more information about that soon.